Hello, everyone. Just going to wait a couple of minutes to let people come on in, and then we will begin our NARCAN Behind Every Bar webinar training. Just one more minute, really. Okay, thank you to everyone for joining this important webinar today. I'm Ariel Palitz, the Executive Director for the Office of Nightlife. For those of you who don't know, we are a dedicated non-enforcement liaison between the city and the nightlife industry. In addition to our focus on safety and harm reduction, which is the purpose of the webinar today, we also work to support nightlife businesses by navigating city bureaucracy, also improving quality of life and relations with your neighbors, as well as promoting and preserving nightlife culture. If you have any issues or questions about your nightlife venue or job, please always feel free to reach out to us at nightlife@media.nyc.gov, right there on the screen. Today's webinar is part of a new series of courses we created called NITE School, or it stands for Nightlife Industry Training and Education, which will be held both virtually and in person. This is a series to share resources and trainings for owners and workers and patrons, addressing how to best engage with the city's agencies while opening and operating nightlife businesses, proactive harm reduction, quality of life issues, and more. For more information about our curriculum, our night school curriculum, you could go to nyc.gov/nightschool. That's NITE school. Today, we are bringing you resources and training as part of the city's harm reduction efforts to combat the growing opioid overdose epidemic. As you likely know, there is an overdose crisis in New York City, and fentanyl continues to drive overdose deaths. In the first 9 months of 2021, there were 1,956 overdose deaths in New York City. That is an overdose every 3 hours. The safety and well-being of the nightlife community is a top priority for the Office of Nightlife. And because of this, we created the NARCAN Behind Every Bar initiative with our partners at the Health Department to provide venues, staff, and security, as well as patrons, with free life-saving training on how to learn how to use Naloxone, and also to get free overdose rescue kits by mail. So you may know that just a few months ago, this program was codified into law with the help of Councilmember Chio Say and Mayor Adams. And also just last week, New York Magazine named this program as number 26 on the 39 reasons to love New York right now, which is pretty cool. It said, number 26 reason to love New York is because the city is training nightlife workers and go-go dancers to save lives. So that's what we're doing here today. But with that said, we know the stigma of substance use in nightlife can be particularly challenging, but the fentanyl crisis is not an issue exclusive to nightlife. Substances may be present in a variety of work settings and gathering places, not just like nightlife venues. But we know that venues and promoters are partners in helping to combat this crisis. And we see venues as places where people can look out for each other. So this is really about bringing life-saving harm reduction tools and resources to all of you in the nightlife community. Every venue and promoter is encouraged to have a few doses of NARCAN on hand and behind the bar in case of a suspected overdose, much like having a CPR kit or a first aid kit behind the bar. So today you will learn how to become a certified opioid overdose responder and how you can receive your overdose rescue kit by mail. Before I introduce my colleague to conduct the training from the Department of Health, just a few quick housekeeping notes. Please use the Q&A feature in the Zoom to let us know your questions throughout the meeting. And then after the presentation, or perhaps even throughout, we will have some additional time for your direct questions. So just put it in the Q&A. Also, this meeting is being recorded and live streamed to Facebook, and a recording will be available to share with your staff and other colleagues who you would like to view the training at a later time. You can also visit nyc.gov/narcanbehindeverybar to find more information on other scheduled trainings by the health department or request a training for your establishment and your staff. And also information on where to obtain fentanyl test strips. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you today's training. This training will be conducted by my colleague at the health department. I'm sorry, Sequisha Shannon at the Overdose Prevention Training is a trainer at the Department of the Bureau of Alcohol and Drug Use Prevention. It's a care and treatment. It's a mouthful. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us here today. I know that this is going to be an incredible informational webinar for everyone, and we appreciate you being here today. Thank you.
Thanks, Ariel, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Shaquasia Shannon. I'm an overdose prevention trainer at the New York City Department of Health, Bureau of Alcohol, Drug Use Prevention, Care, and Treatment. As Ariel said, it's a mouthful, but that is the name of the bureau that I work in within the agency. So I am going to share my slides just so that we can get the training started, and really appreciate everyone being here with me this afternoon. So you should be able to see my slides now. So if someone can put into the chat, yes, we can see your slides. I know everything is working on my end. So as mentioned today's training is really focusing on establishing and making sure that folks know how to recognize the signs of someone potentially having an opioid overdose, and making sure folks know how to respond to that. So great. Perfect. We can see the slides. So before getting into basically the meat of the training, we always want to start our training with the content advisory. We acknowledge how our trainings can bring up a lot of emotions because we're talking about the far-reaching impacts of our overdose crisis, but also acknowledging that overdose crisis shines a grim light on structural racism and racial inequities that exist within our society. And the topics covered today may draw up challenging and stigmatizing experiences. So we don't want to overlook that fact, because acknowledging that this is present with all of us, and we just encourage folks to take care of themselves during and after today's training. So to start off, to make sure that everyone knows what's going to be happening in about the next 50 minutes I have left with you all, we're first going to talk about how New Yorkers are being impacted by our overdose crisis, and then go into understanding what an opioid overdose is and why naloxone is such an important tool. Then we'll go deeper into the steps of responding to an opioid overdose. So these are the things we need you to be aware of, things we need you to say and do when potentially responding to an opioid overdose. And then I'll talk specifically about how you can access naloxone as part of today's training, as well as after today's training if necessary. So before getting into the data of how New Yorkers are being impacted, it's always good to start off on some common ground of key terms. So today, when I mention opioids, I am talking about a specific class of pain relievers. So you may know about prescription painkillers that we tend to call opioid analgesics, but also acknowledging that opioids include substances such as heroin and fentanyl. As mentioned before, fentanyl is a drug product that is in our drug supply in New York City. We want to make sure that folks are aware of its presence in our drug supply. And at the end of today's training, if all you remember about fentanyl is what I need you to remember is that is a highly potent and fast acting opioid. So what does that mean? That means it is a strong opioid that works quickly. We'll talk a little bit more about fentanyl and how it's driving our overdose crisis in New York City, but just want to make sure that everyone has a clear understanding of what fentanyl is that is a strong and fast acting opioid. And as part of today's training, you'll be learning more about how to respond to an opioid overdose with the use of naloxone. So if you've heard of NARCAN before, you've heard of naloxone. So naloxone is a safe medication that reverses the effects of opioids and prevents that overdose from being fatal. So it's really important for folks to know that it is safe, reverses the effects of overdoses. And this is what we would call that reversal medication when we're talking about that life-saving medication of naloxone. So I just want to check in, and it seems that I'm getting that blue wheel. There we go. Finally updated on that slide. So you can see the written out definition of naloxone for today's key terms. So just to start off again, we're going to talk about how overdoses are affecting New Yorkers. So we know in 2020, this is our last full year of data that we have on hand, that we lost 2,062 people due to a fatal drug overdose. And this unfortunately is an increase from the year in 2019 of 565 people. So as Ariel mentioned earlier, that the first 3 quarters of 2021, that we saw again another set of time of high numbers and rates of fatal overdoses. Hopefully in the next few months, we'll be able to have available to everyone the numbers that we have for the year 2021, a full calendar year for 2021. But we know in 2020, losing 2,062 people equated to about losing about 1 person every 5 hours in New York City due to a drug overdose. And this is acknowledging that this means that more New Yorkers died of a drug overdose than homicides, suicides, and motor vehicle crashes combined. So it's really important that folks know more information about our overdose crisis in New York City and the steps that they can actively take to reverse someone's overdose. But before getting into that, I do want to just highlight in regards to how our overdose crisis is impacting our neighborhoods of residents. So right now on the screen, you see there is a map, and on that map is the rate of overdose deaths by neighborhood of residents in 2020. And the way this map works is that the deeper the shade of blue you see, the higher the rate of fatal overdoses were in those communities. Outlined in gold or yellow, you may see on the screen, are the top 5 neighborhoods in regards to rates of fatal overdoses. So it's really important to show this map because it's important for folks in New York City to know that this is completely a citywide crisis. Every neighborhood in New York City has been impacted by our overdose crisis. And at the same time, it's really important to also acknowledge that even though this is a citywide crisis, this crisis is not impacting every community the same. So we know in 2020, the rate of overdose deaths increased among Black New Yorkers and Black, Latino, and white New Yorkers. However, it's important to acknowledge that among white New Yorkers, the rate of overdose deaths increased in 2020, but that was the first time after 3 consecutive years of decreases. The rate of overdose deaths among Asian and Pacific Islander New Yorkers remained the same from 2019 to 2020. Rates of overdose deaths increased among residents of all neighborhood poverty levels, but in 2020, it's still important to point out that the rate of overdose deaths continue to be the highest in very high poverty neighborhoods. Residents of very high poverty neighborhoods actually made up nearly 1/3 of overdose fatalities among New York City residents in 2020. So as prior years, these geographical patterns reflect inequities in income and wealth, employment, education, criminal legal system involvement, and housing. And all of these factors have been linked to an increased risk of overdose fatality and are a result of structural racism and a disinvestment in communities. So to continue on to have a better understanding of how our boroughs are facing, to give a better sense of what your patrons may be experiencing or how they're being impacted, how your staff or how you yourself may be being impacted. We know that the highest rate and largest number of drug overdose deaths were among Bronx residents in 2020. And it's important to point out that rate and number are not the same, but they are kind of related to each other. So rate, as I just showed you on that previous slide with the map of the 5 boroughs, we're looking at the graph that is on the left in blue labeled rate of drug overdose deaths. So rate is taking that number of fatal overdoses in comparison to the population size. So they are related, but they are not quite the same. So we know the Bronx had the highest rates and the highest number, but when looking at rate graph on the left side of the screen, we know that Staten Island actually came in second in regards to rate. However, when we look at number, which is just a count or a tally, which are showing on the slide, on the right side of the slide in the graph labeled number of drug overdose deaths in pink, we see that Staten Island actually came in 5th of the 5 boroughs and losing the least number of people due to a drug overdose. 132 people is still way too many people losing their life due to a drug overdose. However, acknowledging that Staten Island's population size is smaller, even losing the least amount of individuals impacts their communities and has an increased rate in regards to fatal overdoses. So no matter where your establishments may lie, it's really important to focus and acknowledge that this is a citywide crisis. When it comes to the boroughs that came in second in regards to the number of fatal overdoses, seeing that the Brooklyn came in second behind the Bronx, and Manhattan, Queens came in third, then Manhattan for 4th. So it's really important to highlight again that no matter where naloxone kits are being put in New York City, acknowledging that there are people who need access to them. So to talk more specifically about what substances were involved in fatal overdoses in 2020, we know that 85% of fatal overdoses in 2020 involved an opioid of any sort. And we know that heroin or fentanyl specifically were involved in 80% of fatal overdoses. Cocaine or crack was involved in almost half at 48% of fatal overdoses. Benzodiazepines, so these are substances such as Ativan, Xanax, that was involved in 19%. So almost 1 in 5 of fatal overdoses. Methadone was involved in 14%, and opioid analgesics, what many people know as prescription painkillers, were involved in 16% of fatal overdoses. So it's really important to highlight 2 things. We know that the majority of fatal overdoses included an opioid. And unfortunately, that means that these were preventable deaths. For the fact that we know naloxone exists, we know that naloxone reverses the effects of opioids. There is a potential for someone to survive that overdose experience when they are provided naloxone. So it's really important that, and great that you're all attending this training to know more about naloxone and the steps you can take or your staff can take if a situation does happen on site. So to also point out that we know when it comes to substances involved in fatal overdoses, approximately half, 48% of overdose deaths in 2020 involved more than one central nervous system depressant. So a central nervous system depressant is a substance that causes someone's breathing to slow down. And when they are mixed together, there is the potential for that to increase someone's risk of an overdose. So acknowledging that central nervous system depressants include alcohol, they include benzodiazepines, and they include opioids. So essentially, if someone has alcohol in their system, they may potentially need less of that amount of opioid to put that person into an overdose. So we'll talk a little bit later about some other common risk factors for someone experiencing an overdose and some possible risk reduction strategies people can use. But to talk a little bit more about fentanyl, we know that fentanyl is the most common substance involved in drug overdose deaths, to the extent in 2020 that it was involved in 77% of fatal overdoses. So as mentioned before in the introduction, that we know that fentanyl is driving our overdose crisis in New York City. So it's really important for folks to know about fentanyl in our drug supply. And when I'm talking about fentanyl in our drug supply that is driving our overdose crisis, I am specifically talking about a non-pharmaceutical fentanyl. So this is a non-pharmaceutical fentanyl is being produced in illicit laboratories. This important for folks to know that we're not, we know that in general, we know that there are pharmaceutical fentanyl products. Those tend to come in patches or lollipop forms. We acknowledge that people can misuse pharmaceutical products, but that is not what is driving our overdose crisis. It is this non-pharmaceutical fentanyl. So fentanyl is a strong opioid. Remember, I mentioned that in that key term. We know that it can be anywhere from 50 to 100 times stronger than morphine, 30 to 50 times stronger than heroin. And we are aware and know that fentanyl is being found in opioid and non-opioid drug products. So we have found fentanyl in heroin, cocaine, or crack, counterfeit pills. So these are pills that have been pressed or pressed pills that people may know them as, or potentially some people may know them as street pills, but they aren't coming from a pharmaceutical source. But also we have found fentanyl in products such as ketamine, methamphetamine, and other drugs purchased off the street or online. So this is really important for folks to be aware of, because the reality is that those who even occasionally use cocaine or crack may not realize their potential risk of experiencing an opioid overdose, because they may not be aware of fentanyl potentially being in their product. So it's really important for folks who do not have a tolerance to opioids, do not have a relationship to opioids, or use other substances, who may not be aware of their risk of an opioid overdose, to have access to naloxone as well. There is no risk of overdosing by touching fentanyl. So we always want to put that information out there, because we do get questions about this, and acknowledge that misinformation about fentanyl, about naloxone, about substances are common, but we're here to really make sure that folks are educated about this information. And we never want folks who are trained to respond to feel that they shouldn't respond to someone's overdose, because they may be at fear of overdosing themselves by just touching someone, touching the product that may be on someone. So it's really important for folks to realize that we want you to follow the steps. We want you to respond to someone's overdose, and that you are not at risk of overdosing by touching fentanyl. So I'm going to pause to see if any questions have come in that I can answer relatively quickly before going into the rest of the training. I am not seeing anything at the moment. I'm going to keep going. If you have questions, please use the Q&A function to send them in. We'll have another designated point, or I'll answer them at the end of the training. So really appreciate that, everyone. So to continue on, I would like to continue, but I'm not sure if PowerPoint is going to let me. So let's try it again. There we go. So when it comes to understanding an opioid overdose, It is really important to get a very general sense of how opioids work in our body. So when someone consumes opioids, they're represented on this screen as purple circles. They do attach or bind to what we all have opioid receptors. And opioid receptors are being represented by these grayish squiggly lines that you see in the image. When someone consumes opioids, it can produce things that they may be looking for and potentially some things they aren't quite looking for. So we know that opioids are a pain reliever, so they can relieve pain. We also know that opioids can relieve withdrawal symptoms. So if someone has been using opioids for some time, it can alleviate those symptoms. But also use of opioids can produce feelings of mental or physical wellness, comfort, or happiness. So there are some side effects that can come along with opioid use. So constipation, nausea, drowsiness, and respiratory depression. And respiratory depression is what we're very concerned about when we're talking about someone experiencing an opioid overdose. So what does respiratory depression mean? It just means slow breathing. So what you see on the screen right now is the process of an opioid overdose and acknowledging that this can take anywhere from minutes to hours to occur. So the pathway you see on the screen is specific to opioids, acknowledging it starts with a toxic amount of an opioid. So this could be a strong strength of an opioid. It can be a large amount of an opioid, or it can be an opioid mixed with other substances. But what happens is that opioid leads to your body's involuntary response to breathe, or involuntary drive to breathe, to start to slow down. And as you see, breathing slows down. It has the potential to stop, and that can potentially has the potential to impact other vital organs like the brain and the heart. And as they slow down more and more, they have the potential to stop. And as you see me work our way across this slide, this puts someone closer and closer to experiencing a fatal overdose. It is rare for someone to die immediately from an overdose. So if someone survived their overdose experience, it is because there was someone there to respond. So it's highlighting again, having access to naloxone at your bar establishments, at your nightlife establishments is extremely important, because your establishment, your staff could be playing an active role in saving someone's life. So remember how I said that fentanyl had two characteristics, that it was strong and that it was fast acting. It's important to highlight, if fentanyl is involved in someone's overdose, it has the potential to shorten the timeline of this process, which also means it has the potential to shorten the timeline responders have to respond. So it's really important that responders who are trained to respond are able to recognize the signs and respond to that person's overdose urgently, because like any medical emergency, time is not always on that person's side. So when we go over the steps, I want to make sure that you know how to identify those 5 common signs of an overdose and proceed on to the next parts of how to respond. But as I mentioned earlier, I wanted to discuss some common risk factors for someone experiencing an overdose. So just wanted to highlight that what you see on the left side of the screen are 5 common risk factors in regards to someone experiencing an overdose. Changing intolerance is the first one listed, specifically someone experiencing using drugs after they have taken a break in their drug use. That break in drug use can lower someone's tolerance to that drug. And if they aren't aware of that lower tolerance and aren't aware that this can place them at increased risk if they use after that break. So it's really important for individuals who may have life experiences that may have created that break. So acknowledging this could be that someone may have been previously released from incarceration. They may have actually been released from a treatment or detox program, or they may have been hospitalized and didn't have access to their drug, or as well. So it's really important for folks to know that this is a common risk factor. As I go over this slide, we'll also talk about some ways that people can lower their risk of an overdose as well. So mixing of drugs, as I mentioned before, mixing of any substances can increase someone's risk of an overdose, but especially those substances called central nervous system depressants that can all increase someone's risk of slow breathing. Drug quality. So purchasing drugs off the street or online is unpredictable to changes in purity and strength. So it's really important for folks to have to be aware that drug quality, inconsistencies, changes in the drug market can be a risk factor for many folks. Acknowledging this risk factor, previous non-fatal overdose, can be a little bit difficult to understand. But we know our research and shows that if someone has experienced a non-fatal overdose, so when I mean non-fatal, that means they experienced an overdose, but they survived that experience, they are now at increased risk of experiencing another overdose. And this has a lot to do with how difficult it is to make behavior changes to drug use, how difficult it is to make changes to someone's drug use. Acknowledging that someone may not have had the time or the resources or access to those resources needed to make those changes or to sustain those changes. So using alone is a little misleading on this list, because using alone is not a risk factor for an overdose. Using alone is a risk factor for a fatal overdose. So it's really important for folks to know and to really highlight on this slide. As I mentioned, these are common risk factors for someone experiencing an opioid overdose. Use of any opioids can put someone at risk of experiencing an overdose, but there are things that people can do to lower that risk. So risk reduction strategies, harm reduction strategies, and we encourage folks to use them if or when possible. So if or when possible, be careful if someone has taken a break or missed a dose. And we encourage folks to use less, go slow, do a slow shot, do a test shot. We encourage folks, if or when possible, to think about and make an overdose response plan. Have a phone on hand to call 911. We encourage folks to buy from people they trust and ask about changes in the drug product. Talk about the drug quality with others to get a sense of how that quality is at the moment. We encourage folks to not use alone. So we, if or when possible, use with someone else and take turns. We want to make sure that there's still someone there to respond in case an emergency does happen, but acknowledging that many people may still feel that using alone is a choice they feel is best for them. But we want them to know that there are still ways to create a system for them to get medical help there for them if needed. So there's a Never Use Alone hotline. That number is 800-484-3731. And what this hotline is basically someone can call the hotline, someone will be on the other end, they will collect information in case they need to send medical help there. And if at any point while on that call, someone becomes unresponsive, they will send medical help. They will call 911 to get medical help to that person's location. So even that person may have physically decided to use alone, they still created a system for someone to get them some help if necessary. And if or when possible, when someone is if or when ready to make changes to their opioid use, it's really gold standard in treating someone with the opioid use disorder, so that with medication for opioid use disorder. And those are medications such as methadone and buprenorphine. They can really help someone with their cravings. It can help someone with the withdrawal symptoms that they'll experience and really help them find the changes that they're looking for in their life. So acknowledging those risk factors and risk reduction strategies are very specific to people who use drugs. We want to make sure that folks who use drugs know of the full toolbox of ways and strategies to help keep themselves safe in regards to drug use. But there's something that we all can do to help change our overdose crisis, to change our society, and in a way that can be really impactful. And that is acknowledging how the words we use matter and how they can perpetuate or push back on stigma. So we know, unfortunately, that drug-related stigma around substance use, around substances is real. It's unfortunately normalized. And unfortunately, that can create very unpleasant, traumatic experiences for people who use drugs. So we're encouraging folks to really use more compassionate, person-centered language as part of these trainings, acknowledging this is something that we all can do to really try to build connections, build community, and really center people's humanity when we're talking with them in regards to drug use. So this is a person who may use drugs. This is someone who's living with a substance use disorder. And we're acknowledging and we're not saying at all that someone can't use potentially stigmatizing language that you see on the left side of this table to discuss their own experience. We acknowledge that identity is extremely personal, but we want folks and encourage folks to think about how the way they use their language, how the way they use words can really challenge stigma, can really center someone's humanity, and really show compassion for others. So I did see a question come in, so I want to take a quick pause to answer that question. So a question came in: when someone is under the influence of ketamine, it's very hard to determine if they are overdosing because they go into a deep state of sleep. How do you tell them apart? And is it logical to administer NARCAN either way? I'm a nightlife promoter and I see this all the time. So this is a really great question. So we'll get into more aspects of that. It is still safe to give naloxone either way. We have a saying, when in doubt, if you see those signs of an opioid overdose, give naloxone. And we'll talk about a little bit about that in the next few slides. And also we'll go over what to do once you recognize those signs. So the steps we're asking you to take is actually making sure that it was necessary to give that person naloxone in that moment. So thanks for that question. So I can't answer it fully because I know it's coming up in the training. So understanding naloxone. So as mentioned before, naloxone is a life-saving medication. It reverses the effects of opioids. And its only function, hold on, there we go. Its only function is to reverse that opioid overdose. It is safe to give. It has no effect if there's no opioids present in someone's system, and it's available in nasal spray into muscular injections. So there are no known negative effects of giving someone naloxone. However, we do want to point out the reality is that if someone has been using opioids for some time or they're opioid dependent, giving someone naloxone can put them into withdrawal. And we know that no one wants to cause someone to go through withdrawal. It is not pleasant at all. And it's really important to highlight that the steps we're having folks take kind of lets us know it's necessary to give that person naloxone. Because if someone is experiencing an opioid overdose and we don't give them the naloxone, they could die. So it's really important, as I go over those steps, that you keep that in mind. There's no way for someone to misuse or become dependent on naloxone, and responders do have New York State liability protection in regards to responding to an opioid overdose with use of naloxone. So we saw this image a little while ago. We see that this image has the opioid sitting on those opioid receptors. We believe they're having an opioid overdose. We're giving them Narcan, the one-step nasal spray formulation of naloxone. And now the naloxone, those bluish, silverish looking circles are now binding to those opioid receptors. It takes about 2 to 8 minutes for naloxone to start working. It takes about 2 to 8 minutes for it to restore that person's breathing. And naloxone will be in that person's system for 30 to 90 minutes. So it's important to highlight these, to start remembering some of these numbers, because these are impacting our response steps. These are telling us the timeline in regards to how we should be doing the steps. But it also gives you really great information, because when someone is given naloxone, the naloxone does not eat up, it does not metabolize, it does not get rid of the opioids in their system. Their body is going to do that at its normal rate. What naloxone does is make sure that that person can breathe. So it bumps the opioids off the receptors so that person can breathe. So even though they may, even with naloxone being in their system for about 30 to 90 minutes, that person may not feel the effects of their substance. However, until their body processes it out, it is still there in their system. So when it comes to responding to an opioid overdose, there are 5 common signs we want you to be able to recognize. So it could be slowed or stopped breathing. The person experiencing the opioid overdose will be unconscious or unresponsive. Their lips or nails may be blue, gray, or white. We're giving 3 color variations because depending on the person's complexion, it may be one of those colors. So people with deeper complexions, the colors may come across more as a gray or white. They may be giving off a deep snoring or gurgling sound as they're trying to get air. And we've seen in fentanyl-involved overdoses, they may present with a muscle stiffness or rigidity where their arms or limbs may be stiff, their chest may be rigid. Their eyes could be open in this rigidity or they could be closed. But even if their eyes are open, they still won't be able to respond to others. So it's important to recognize these potentially five signs, because someone's sign of having an opioid overdose may be one of these signs. It may be a mix of these signs. But if you see someone is having any of these signs, we want folks to take the next steps of overdose response steps. And that next step is to check if they're responsive. So this is going into the question that we received earlier. So first, we want you to shout at the person, hey, I need you to wake up. Okay, are you okay? If you don't, I'm gonna have to get help for you. So you may need to say, hey, if you don't wake up, you don't respond to, you may have to call 911 to get medical help. But if someone is not responding to the shouting that is happening, then we want you to do the sternum rub. So you see an image of that on the slide, and on video, I'm going to demonstrate it as well. What you would do if you need to check for someone's responsiveness, you would make a fist, and the knuckles of your fist would find that person's breastbone or sternum, and you will grind your knuckles into their sternum for about 3 to 5 seconds with pressure. If you're doing this on the other side of the screen, you may notice that it is not comfortable, it's kind of painful, but you didn't hurt yourself. This is a safe way to test and to see if someone is responsive on some level. So we always want folks to do that, to do the sternum rub before giving naloxone. So again, always perform the sternum rub before giving naloxone. So if you saw one of those 5 common signs, you did the shouting, the person didn't respond, you did the sternum rub, the person didn't respond, then we're going to go further into what needs to happen. How do you administer naloxone? How do you call to get medical help? But as mentioned before, sometimes it is hard to tell if someone is just under the influence of an opioid, under the influence of other substances, or if they're actually overdosing. Again, if there's no opioids in their system, naloxone is not going to have an effect. It's like giving someone water, but it's still safe to give if you're unsure what someone has taken. But also important to know, if someone responds to the shouting or they respond to the sternum rub you provide, even if that response is verbal, that is still a response. They don't need to be provided naloxone in that moment, but you want to try to keep them alert and monitor them closely. An overdose could still be possible, so keep that naloxone nearby and stay with them or ensure that they won't be left alone. But we encourage folks, when in doubt, call 911 for medical help. And when calling 911, give the dispatcher the address and specific location and tell them the signs that this person is experiencing, because they ring alarms saying like, this is an emergency. This person is not breathing. They aren't responding. They're turning blue or gray. That alone will tell the dispatcher this is an emergency and this person needs help. Because there may be many, we want to call 911 because this may not be an overdose. Acknowledging those 5 common signs of an opioid overdose are not exclusive to opioid overdoses. It can be another medical emergency. So we do encourage you to call 911. Also acknowledging, depending how long someone may have been in the process of an overdose, there may be other medical complications that may have come up, and EMS can help support in those situations. But also acknowledging more doses of naloxone may be needed. So the naloxone kits that we give out in our blue bags do come with 2 doses of NARCAN. So 2 doses of NARCAN. However, it is possible that more naloxone may be needed to reverse an overdose. And guess who has more naloxone with them when you call? EMTs. So we do encourage folks to call 911, but understand how this can still be a scary choice to make in calling 911. So we want folks to know about the 911 Good Samaritan law. So the law offers some protections in regards to the person experiencing the overdose and the person calling 911 from prosecution for other things that may be occurring, such as drugs up to an A2 felony offense, alcohol for underage drinkers, cannabis of any amount, paraphernalia offenses of sharing drugs. Acknowledging that this law isn't perfect, but this is the law that we do have available to us in New York State. It does not provide any explicit legal protections for those who may have probation or parole violations, violations for open warrants, issues related to immigration or child welfare. So acknowledging why it's important to think about what an overdose response plan looks like, not just for individuals, but also for your establishments. What does an overdose response plan look like for our organization? So thinking about what an individual response plan can do, it acknowledges the difficulties of calling 911, but still allows for the person who's responding to take care of themselves while responding to someone else's overdose. So we know as just as many reasons why people may have for calling 911, there are just as many reasons why people feel like calling 911 may not feel like a safe choice. Public safety and public health professionals and partners believe and encourage calling 911, but acknowledging the reality that everyone may not feel safe making that choice. They may have responded to previous overdoses and don't feel like medical intervention is necessary and they can handle the situation. They may not want to potentially deal with the stigmatizing interaction, acknowledging that the stigma attached to drug use can impact someone's willingness to want to call 911 for medical help. People may have a fear for their personal safety when interacting with first responders, or they may have some other legal matters that impact their life that they aren't sure could be impacted by calling for medical help. And acknowledging that we have a long history of criminalizing drug use in our societies and policies around drug use. New York City does have NYPD overdose response squads where people acknowledging that if you call for medical help, it's likely that NYPD can be dispatched along with EMTs and EMS. Acknowledge they may actually arrive before EMTs are to the scene. They can follow up people afterwards, investigate the scene, and acknowledging that police officers are mandated reporters of suspected child abuse, neglect, or maltreatment. So just as many reasons why someone may decide to call 911, we also live in a reality that people have life experiences where making that call doesn't feel like the best decision for them. So thinking about what is that overdose response plan going to look like? So when it comes to giving naloxone, administering a dose of NARCAN, there are 3 main steps that I'm going to demonstrate to you, and we have them listed on the screen on the slide as peel, place, and press. So NARCAN comes in a blister pack and is on video. That blister pack has a peel tab in the top right corners. We want folks to use that peel tab to gain access to the NARCAN device. So once you have access to the device, I have a test device on screen at the moment. You want to use your index and middle fingers and put it on the top of the device around the nozzle. And what you want to do is just put your thumb to the side. You don't need to put it on the plunger at that moment. We want you to do the second step of place. Place the nozzle in the person's nostrils to the tips of their nostrils are touching your fingers on the device. And then use your thumb to press the plunger, that third step of press. Once you have done that, you have administered all the naloxone in that NARCAN device. Then we want you to do what can be really hard in an emergency situation. We want you to wait 2 minutes. See if that 1 dose of naloxone was enough to reverse that overdose. But if you notice after 2 minutes, that person still has not responded, we want you to go back into the kit, get the second dose of NARCAN, and repeat the steps. So peel, place, and press. Ideally, the second dose should go in the opposite nostril than the first dose. However, if you cannot remember which nostril you gave the first dose in, if someone is not responsive after 2 minutes after getting that dose, the most important thing to do is to make sure you give them that second dose in whichever nostril that you remember. So when someone has become responsive after being given naloxone, they could be feeling a mix of different emotions. Acknowledging still the most common emotion that we know folks experience is that they're confused and afraid. So try your best to calmly explain to the person what was happening. Explain to them that they were overdosing. So this could be included, like, tell them the signs that said this was a serious situation. I tried to wake you up. You weren't responding. So we gave you naloxone. And acknowledge and ask that person, are they feeling okay? The reality is they may be going through withdrawal. Reassure them as a naloxone wears off in about 30 to 90 minutes. They should start to feel better, but also encourage them during that 30 to 90 minute window to not using any more drugs, because it is not likely to reduce the withdrawal symptoms they're feeling, but it may increase their risk of another overdose. So discuss with that person if they want to receive follow-up medical care. If that person declines medical attention, see if someone can stay with them for at least 3 hours to make sure that they're okay. So if you or your staff are CPR trained, we encourage folks to do CPR and follow their CPR training anytime someone isn't breathing. But if your staff or yourself are not CPR trained, for opioid overdoses, we encourage rescue breaths for those who are not CPR trained. So inside the NARCAN kits will also come a white packet that gives access to a face shield. So when it is torn open, you can unfold the face shield to help you provide a rescue breath. So you see an outline of a face, and over the mouth region, you'll see that there is a filter piece. Also at the bottom, you'll see that there's language. So when using the face shield, you want to make sure that the person is on their back, their chin is tilted up, and their mouth is open. Match the face shield with the filter piece being over the person's open mouth, making sure that you can read the side of the language at the bottom from left to right, because that is the side you blow into when providing rescue breaths. So what you will do is then pinch that person's nose closed. This will be between you and the individual. You will match your mouth over that filter piece and then give that person 2 normal size breaths and then 1 breath every 5 seconds. Another thing you can do to also support someone who's having an opioid overdose, in addition to giving them naloxone, providing CPR for those who are trained in CPR or rescue breathing, is putting someone in the recovery position. And that is rolling someone over on their side, such as the image is in the bottom right of the slide. So putting someone in this supported position is the safest position for them to be in, because it prevents them from choking and keeps their airways open. You want to put them in the recovery position if there are 3 things that are not happening in that very moment. So if you are not actively administering NARCAN, you are not actively doing CPR or rescue breathing, or if this person has to be left alone for any amount of time, we want you to put them in the recovery position. Again, that is the safest position for them to be in if those 3 things are not happening. And just some last things we want you to consider before we talk about how to request naloxone kits for your establishments. We want folks to know, especially your establishments, we talked about overdose response planning as on an individual level, but we wanted you to think about it as well on establishment level, on an organizational level. What are some really important response elements to think about when figuring out how do you want staff to respond to overdoses if they happen to happen on location? So monitor, assess, and communicate. So thinking about acknowledging that bathrooms and establishments may be a place where people may use drugs or where someone may have an overdose. So someone may want to monitor bathrooms to see, make sure folks aren't staying in the bathrooms too long, or if someone needs help while they're in the restrooms. Calling for 911 and creating a response area. So making sure that staff know, create space. So when 911 is called and first responders get there, they know exactly where they need to go. Administering naloxone, so making sure that staff know where the naloxone kit is and knowing that they know how to respond. Additionally, engaging with people, the person experiencing the emergency once they have come responsive, but also potentially others who may be at the scene, and how are you going to manage people on site. Encouraging information to provide staff and thinking about how do you want them to engage with first responders once they're there, and if there's any follow-up or reporting that they should be doing to you as a manager, a supervisor, or owner. If these are just really important elements to think about, because then your staff will know what to do in case that emergency happens in the moment. So when we're talking about naloxone access for bar and nightlife establishments, it's really important to talk about shared access naloxone kits. So it's really important for folks that have access to naloxone, but that doesn't mean everyone needs an individual kit as a staff person. So think about it in a sense of having a shared access naloxone kit or communal kit is a kit that could be at your location where multiple people can use in case there's an overdose on site. So think about how you have first aid kits. You may not, everyone doesn't have an individual first aid kit, but your bar may have a first aid kit, your different floors of your establishment may have a first aid kit. So thinking about it in that way and help you determine how many naloxone kits you want to request. So establishments can get up to 5 naloxone kits. So I want you to think, how many communal kits you would need. Does your bar restaurant need 1 or 2 naloxone kits for that? Everyone on staff know exactly where they're located. A convenient place could be next to the first aid kit at your locations. And when it comes to New York State liability protection, this does apply to communal kits. So as mentioned earlier on Office of Nightlife's website, there's also information about how to access fentanyl test strips. So fentanyl test strips can be a really important harm reduction strategy that can give people information about if there's fentanyl in their drug product. There's also information about how to properly test someone's substances. Depending on the substance, it does determine a different process of preparation to get an accurate reading. And there's also will be information of where you can purchase fentanyl test strips. But in regards to the last 5 minutes that I have with you all of how do you access naloxone as part of today's training. So what you see on screen and what I'm going to try to put into the chat is the website on how you can request naloxone kits be mailed to you. So we mail naloxone kits within the 5 boroughs of New York City. And when you access that site, they'll ask you one question is this a part of a nightlife training? We just want encourage folks to say yes, so that we can get the best information in regards to who's requesting our naloxone kits. Again, you can request up to 5 kits. I'm gonna try to put this in the chat. There we go. It should be coming through. And if you need access to naloxone sooner, looking at us on our webpage to see where in your community you can access naloxone. So these kits will be mailed directly to your establishment. You do need to request them to be mailed though. And what comes in your naloxone kit, you will see are the 2 doses of NARCAN, the face shield, 2 non-latex gloves, educational materials. So the steps of responding to an opioid overdose. Inside the kit, it looks like this, but it can be opened up and is on English and in Spanish. So English on one side, Spanish on the other side, and it goes through all of the steps of responding that we went through today's training, and a blue certificate card of completion. So when you get that card, it's really important for folks to know you want to put the date and the name of your establishment for communal kits. So you want to put the name of your bar, restaurant, or nightlife establishment or club and dash communal kit, and put that blue card back into that blue bag into the naloxone kit that you get. So it's really important that folks who would have access to naloxone kit know how to respond. So if they can attend the training, that would be great. But at minimum, you want to make sure that folks reviewed the educational material that comes inside the naloxone kit. And if you happen to ever use your naloxone kit and need access to a refill, on the back of that same blue card is our email address. Please reach out to us. We would love to hear about your experience responding to someone's overdose, and hopefully have you complete an anonymous report and how we can continue to make sure that naloxone is available to New Yorkers. But even more importantly, we want you to reach out to us so that you can get a refill on your naloxone kit. So if you use one of the 2 doses in the kit, reach out to us. A full kit is 2 doses. If the kit is lost, stolen, or damaged, as well as if the naloxone has expired or is near expired. So expiration dates are on the back of that blister pack. So we want to make sure you stay aware of those expiration dates and reach out to us. But if unfortunately an emergency situation happens, someone is potentially overdosing at your establishment, and you notice that the Narcan medication has expired, in emergency situations, we want you to use the expired naloxone and call 911. Expired naloxone is better than no naloxone in an overdose. So once again, just to summarize today's training, naloxone is a safe medication that can reverse effects of opioid overdoses. Look for those 5 common signs of an opioid overdose. If you recognize one or more of those signs, we want you to check for responsiveness by shouting and then doing the sternal rub. Again, always do the sternal rub before giving naloxone. So if that person is not responding to the sternal rub, give them naloxone. It is safe to give when in doubt of what someone may have consumed. And additionally, provide additional support by getting medical help, doing rescue breathing or CPR if you're CPR trained, and putting someone in the recovery position. And we always encourage folks to report or refill the naloxone kit. So I'm going to stop sharing, acknowledging the time. It is 2 o'clock. I will answer any final questions that folks may have. I did see a question that just came in. I only have one. How long does naloxone last? The expiration dates, again, are on the back of the blister packs. The kits that tend to go out last, the expiration dates tend to be somewhere from about a year to 18 months away from the date that we ship them. So just be mindful that the exact expiration dates will be back on the back of the blister pack. Sorry, the sun is shining. You'll be able to see on the back of the blister pack. So I'm not seeing any other questions. I do want to thank everyone for their time today. If you have any questions after today's training, I do want to put our email address into the chat, or if you need to request a naloxone training as well, please reach out to us at the New York City Department of Health.
Thank you so much, Sequasia. Thanks so much for being here today. We're so proud to be continuing this partnership and the NARCAN Behind Every Bar initiative with you and your borough. And thank you to everyone for attending today's training. We hope you will be able to take the lessons from the training to help make your spaces safer for everyone in the unfortunate event of any overdose incident. Just a reminder, you can always reach out to us directly with any issues, and in particular on this topic, if you're interested in scheduling your staff for a more in-depth training. For additional trainings, bystander intervention, active shooter preparedness, and other matters, you can stay tuned to our Night School initiative. That's nyc.gov/night school, NITE school. And you can email us anytime at nightlife@media.nyc.gov. So thanks everyone for coming, and have a great rest of your day.